Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for inviting me to speak here today. Today I'd like to just go through, as mentioned, just the challenges and opportunities as we see it as JBS here in Australia. A little bit about JBS. Most of you know our company, but we've been here in Australia since 2007 when we purchased AMH, and they had the plants in Queensland. And then we had a rapid growth in our business here, really doubling the size of our business in the last 4.5 years. And so we're the largest meat processor here, here in Australia. Okay, so on my presentation today, I'd like to go through what the current position is. I think Scott's done a really good job already explaining where Australia sits at the moment. I'd like to go into the dynamics of the global meat business, really just on the beef. I'm really going to concentrate on the beef business. I'd like to say that the dynamics of our business is changing rapidly. When I first came here in 2007, I was, I came out with one of the owners of JBS, and the Queensland Country Life had a lovely picture of myself and Junior Batista, and they had a big title, The Boys from Brazil. And one of the things we had when we first came here was we were seen as a threat coming into the market. Brazil was a threat to Australia. And I think what I'll show in this presentation, actually, Brazil is actually an opportunity for Australia. The dynamics of what's happening in that country today, with the rapid growth in the consumption of beef products, of dairy products, the growth in the middle class, the rising incomes, and what that gives opportunities to us here in Australia in our beef industry, not just in selling beef to South America, but also in markets which were traditionally very, very strong for Brazil. That goes into the opportunities, and I want to talk about some of the threats as we see for the business here. And there are very, very strong issues in our industry today with rising costs, and I'm going to go through some of that today. So whilst the position out there, we always say, look, the demand for beef is going to be strong. We've got to really make sure that here in Australia, we're going to be competitive in the market so we can take advantages of those opportunities. Because there's a very big risk today that we will price ourselves out of some of those markets. And if we just look at always one side of the demand and supply equation, we can delude ourselves and say, well, the future looks very rosy for us. But really, we've got to look after how we're actually producing the product and the costs involved in producing the beef today. So this is just a very sort of generic, and I've got 2011, this is 2010, really showing who the biggest beef producers are, with the United States and Brazil and the EU being the largest, China growing, and Australia just further down the line. Who's the major exporters? This is 2010, and really, if I look at the 2011 figures, aren't finally complete today, but the United States has actually increased quite substantially. I believe it actually even overtook Brazil as an exporter. Australia maintained its position, but the market is extremely fluid, extremely fluid. And if I showed a picture of that in 2007, 2006, you'll see a rapid change in the colours on those pie charts. Who's the major importers in the world? Well, the United States is still a big driver. One of the big ones we see there is Russia. It's a very, very important market for beef consumption. Has grown quite rapidly. I had the pleasure of looking after the JBS office in Russia before I came here to Australia, and I used to fly up from London to Moscow every month, and I could see, and I did that for probably nearly 2 years, I could see the changes going on in that market. And it's quite remarkable to see the growing prosperity of not just in the major conurbations of St. Petersburg and Moscow, but outside as well, showing great opportunities for actually expanding beef sales there. Look at global meat consumption, and really, if I can get this pointer to work here. Can't get it to work. But anyway, if you look on the left-hand side of the graph, you see the major countries, the major beef-producing countries, Argentina, Uruguay, USA, and Brazil, very large beef consumption. Where the opportunity is really is on the right-hand side of the graph, and you'll see that move up. Russia, again, is quite a long way down, but I would suggest in a few years' time, you will see that move quite significantly upwards. I think in Argentina, Uruguay, US and Brazil will probably remain fairly stable. Brazil, I think, would increase slightly, but I think you'll see on this right-hand side of this graph, those where the opportunities are, and I think as Scott was saying, a lot of those are actually emerging markets, which is great news for us here in Australia. This is a very, very good graph, well, not a graph, but a picture showing what's the animal protein consumption during the last decade. And again, reinforcing again what Scott was saying, where the major growth has been. And if you just look at some of the traditional markets where we've been exporting to, North America, the EU, even a bit of East Asia, if you look at, that's really Japan and Korea. But look where the opportunities are, the big opportunities are, that big sway through Africa, the Middle East, Russia, and really, I haven't got one for China, but China would be another one there, and Southeast Asia. That's where the growth is going to come in our export sales. But we have to be competitive. I mean, the interesting one is actually South America, a 32% increase. I would suggest if you put up another graph in the next couple of years, that will be increased even more. You've seen tremendous growth there, as I say, in the middle classes in Brazil, and also the rest of South America and Chile as well. And there's big opportunities there to actually sell more beef, believe it or not, from Australia, which we've been doing, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the really big growth areas, as in Middle East. Middle East is an area where Brazil's really had it all to themselves. I was on the other side of the fence 6-7 years ago. I was selling a lot of Brazilian beef into the Middle East. One advantage just for JBS, we've got our own office in the Middle East. And we know a lot of those customers, which were traditionally buying Brazilian beef, now swapping over to Australian beef, which is really very good for us. And as I say, in the former USSR, in Russia, a very big market. Southeast Asia, we've already mentioned. Indonesia, an incredibly important market for us. And the rest of Southeast Asia, with the growth in incomes and the growth in propensity to consume beef, is a big opportunity, and also into Africa. But again, we come back to we have to be competitive. We haven't got it all to ourselves. There's lots of other different proteins which are competing for that to be on the plate there. So when we say that's the opportunity, but let's just be realistic. There's big competition out there for that business. How do we work at JBS? Well, we always try to balance it on internal and external markets. It's a great strength of our company. We've done that here in Australia. We've done that here in Brazil. Operating internationally, we've brought a lot of different skills here to Australia of exporting different types of cuts which haven't been exported out of here from Australia previously. And I'll mention that when we first came here, I stood up at a breakfast meeting in, I think it was the ECHA in 2007, and again it was an elders breakfast meeting, and again there was that negative feedback from some parts of the industry saying, well, these guys in Brazil, they'll steal our markets. And I was very pleased to stand up and actually say we just contracted our first container of meat from Australia to Brazil. And the whole room went quiet. So you're crazy, you didn't do that. Yes, we've just done that. And that's been a big development of our business recently. It's quite interesting that when you're in Brazil, the major consumption in Brazil, the forequarter meats were really used in the manufacturing process, and they're a big, that's what most people could afford to eat, and you exported a lot of your strip loins, your tenderloins, your cube rolls. Well, today we're actually exporting rump caps. We've actually done some strip loins into Brazil because the demand is there. And that's quite an incredible, that's only in 4 or 5 years. And that is absolutely incredible to think what you think, what is possible or not possible, or you're bloody crazy, you think you're going to do that, but actually that's what we've done. The other important market there in South America is Chile. Chile is a huge importer of beef. A lot of the meat is actually trucked over the Andes from Brazil, from Paraguay and Argentina. The last 3 years, we've exported a huge amount of Australian beef there at a much higher price than the Brazilian product. We've actually managed to position the Australian beef as a high-quality product into that market, dealing directly with supermarkets in that area. The product actually sold as Australian beef, and promoted as such, and that's been a great success of something which is possible. And what's really caused that? Well, I think if you have a look at what's happened in Argentina with the Kirchner's policy of consuming everything internally and not wanting to export because it pushes the prices of meat up. There's more demand, so they try to bring demand down. So there's been less product exported out of Argentina. Uruguay's got a limited herd, and Brazil, with the big consumption internally, there's an opportunity there for Australia. And those opportunities will continue. They'll continue. And I speak with our Brazilian colleagues on a regular basis, and you can see just what is traded in that market today is completely different than when I went back to Brazil in 2001 to trade meat. I was working for one of JBS's competitors. It's a completely different business today than it was not so very long ago. So that dynamic nature of the market is so very, very important. To make money in our business, we've got to make sure we can sell every part of the carcass for the best possible price. We've brought a lot of expertise here to Australia to do that. And parts, as I say, parts of the cuts where you think is not of value or lower value, we've actually found those markets throughout the world, and that's really been based on our expertise in Brazil, in Argentina, and in Uruguay. Every cut has its value. I remember when I first went to Brazil, I was amazed that the tenderloin was, tenderloin here in Australia is the highest value product. In Brazil, it's probably one of the medium to low values because there's no demand for it, which is quite incredible. You've really got to understand those markets to actually say what you're going to do, what you're going to export. The picanha, which we export from here to Australia, from Australia to Brazil, is a very high value part of the carcass. It's probably worth much more than the whole rump together. So all those sort of things are very, very important to get the best out of the carcass to actually make the job work.